So, hello everyone virtually. Welcome to this session on risk sharing, and I should say partnership and the path to localization. It is 3:30 Geneva time. I will wait a little bit to ensure that we have the best participation possible with the audience. So I will wait another 2 minutes and then we will start the session. Okay, so we're going to start the session. So welcome everybody in the room and in the session. It is a pleasure to welcome you all on this panel on risk sharing, partnerships, and localization of humanitarian assistance. So let me start first with saying this panel is going to last for about an hour and a half. We will discuss with the panelists and answer questions and propose best practices, and we'll have a particular case that will be presented to us during the session. After which there will be about 20-25 minutes for question and answers. So as the session goes on, I invite the audience to put questions in the Q&A, and we will, I hope, be able to answer some, if not all, by the end of the session. So it is a pleasure for me to welcome you on this panel. We gather here today as we acknowledge the need to carefully look at the way humanitarian aid is delivered, consider the various modalities, but also look at how we place local actors at the center to achieve empowerment of these local actors, strengthen the response effectiveness, and promote sustainability, while at the same time, and I think that will be the subject of the discussion, ensure that the risk they face, that the local and national responders to crisis face, are recognized, resourced, and shared. Several initiatives have looked at increasing the access, the capacity, and the funding of local actors. However, for too long, the national organizations and local organizations, first responders in crisis, have shouldered the greatest operational challenges and security risks, often with inadequate support. This brings challenges that we will discuss today. 2024 has been a terrible year in terms of security for the humanitarian sector, particularly for national and local NGOs, where in 2024 alone, according to the Aid Workers Security Database, about 270 aid workers for national and local NGOs were wounded, killed, or kidnapped. Today, we come together to engage in an important conversation to address the issue of effective security risk management for national and local NGOs as partners, how we can move from the more traditional security strategy of risk transfer to a genuine risk sharing in partnership, and how to better support the security and sustainability of local organizations. This panel will discuss ideas, but also, I hope, propose best practices and actionable recommendations. So let us use this opportunity to listen to the panelists, learn, work together to move forward on this important topic of security risk management, shared responsibility, equity, trust. As organizations involved in partnership and as the path to localization increases, how do we effectively address this issue of growing insecurity, effective shared security risk management? What are the lessons identified and I hope learned, and best practices developed in this field? For this panel, I am joined by Giulia Boni, the localization advisor for Intersos. Christina Wheely, Director of Insecurity Insight. Dimitri Kotsiras, Research and Program Manager for GISF. We will be joined a little bit later by Elmedi Aguakina, the President of the Association Malienne pour la Survie au Sahel and Head of the Plateforme des ONG Actives dans l'Humanitaire, who will discuss with Julia of a particular project. Anthony Neal, the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Communications from INSO, and Stefano Peveri, Senior Partnership Officer for the World Food Programme. So let's start. In my opening remarks, I mentioned the resources or the lack thereof that our national and local NGOs or partners are often facing. We often hear that there are little resources, which could explain why SRM is not always effective. First and foremost, in this current climate, I wanted to ask, is effective security risk management for national and local NGO, first and foremost, a resource or financial issue? And Anthony, I know you wanted to contribute to this particular question.
Thanks, Eric. So yeah, no, whilst I think it's often framed as primarily a financial issue, no, I don't believe that risk sharing is primarily a financial issue. Obviously, resources are important. They're important to everything we do in the aid sector. It's how we deliver assistance. It's how we pay our staff. And I know colleagues will talk a little bit more in terms of, how can we ensure that national and local NGOs have adequate resources to be able to invest in security risk management. But I think more fundamentally, effective risk sharing is about listening to the needs of our partners. It's about transparency. It's about equitable partnership, equitable and meaningful engagement of our local partners in program design. It's around understanding each other's risk tolerances. And it's around understanding also our existing capacities to mitigate and treat those risks. From INSO side, it's also around what access to information do people have. INSO is, surprisingly to many, one of the largest global networks of national NGOs across the world. We have 600 national NGO partners accessing INSO services. However, we're aware that there are barriers to how national NGOs utilize that data, how they access that data, and it's something that we are this year looking at trying to address and better understand what are some of the systemic issues that prevent national NGOs from accessing information. That's not a resource issue, that's a structural issue within the system that prevents national and local actors accessing the same level of information as international actors and being able to mitigate their risks accordingly. I think one of the problems with seeing it is, from a purely financial point of view, is it almost presumes a lack of capacity as a starting point, which automatically starts to remove the agency of national and local actors from the risk management process and from managing their own risks. It also becomes very easy for us to start to impose how we do security risk management on our national and local partners and essentially propose ill-adapted structures and risk management measures to the issues that national and local actors face. I'm going to end with, none of this is really groundbreaking. The process is adopt the principles of partnership and implement the principles of partnership. They've been around for many years, and I think this is also another space in which we need to look at how we implement those pre-existing principles and hold ourselves accountable to those.
Yeah. So on the issue of resources, I mean, writ large, but on the issue of financial, is there, and I know, Julia, you will discuss a particular part of the project that discusses access to funding, but any other points on funding? And I know this is potentially a subject that is very close to everybody here as we're going through the current situation we're in. But funding, anyone else?
Yeah, if I can chime in. So GISF held a conference on security risk management, but particularly focusing on resourcing for security risk management just late last month with its membership. And donors and other local actors who participated. And as it was centered in resourcing, fair enough, you can feel like that was the sort of central argument to every issue that we're facing, in particular in funding environment. And not to discount anything that Anthony said, I think these are very valid points, but it is still a major issue that needs to be considered. I mean, there's the fact is, even from a report last year looking at the status of frontline humanitarian workers, less than 50% of local national NGOs have access to security plans or can do risk monitoring and have basic, or don't even have basic security infrastructure. And that's basically the thing that came out of this is that project-based funding models doesn't allow these organizations to cover their costs for essential protections like insurance or even equipment and so on. So that is a tangible issue that still needs to be brought up and needs to be considered. And we've done our own research looking at the sort of approaches taken by donors, bilateral institutional donors on their funding processes, their terms and conditions and so on. And there's a reality that there are some cumbersome funding processes in play, that there's donor-imposed restrictions. Oftentimes, security risk management isn't even a dedicated budget line, but is something that is supposed to be passed on to the grantees as part of their indirect costs. And of course, there's inadequate risk-sharing mechanisms. And just to mention, from our own survey with our membership, 60% of those who responded, which is the majority of our membership, basically laid out that they struggle to allocate security funding to partners due to donor restrictions. So that is something that I'd like to flag as a particularly difficult issue. So there are barriers to accessing direct security funding. And there was also a lot of conversation around issues of due diligence and the compliance requirements that further create additional barriers. And inevitably, there's the questions around trust and the sort of reinforcing of existing power imbalances in those partnerships that eventually leads to risk transfer rather than risk sharing, because the local actors provide minimal input into decision making, unfortunately. And so, and just another thing, the majority of insurance markets are often inaccessible to local and national actors. So that is also a problem with exposure that the local actors face compared to their international peers. So, we did acknowledge a certain number of recommendations that have come out of that conference. So there's obvious ones tied to donors and what they can do, which includes to separate budget lines to recognize the unique security risks and the needs that local actors are exposed to invest in different types of insurance models or subsidies to allow for affordable coverage for local actors. Of course, to engage in proactive dialogue, which is part of that process of, as Anthony brought up, adhering to sort of principles of partnership, and that goes along the streaming down from the donor down to the subgrantee, and which is often the case in these international partnerships. And then an idea that was quite novel, that was I'm sure it's been talked about before, but something that we're definitely looking further into is to try to create some kind of passport for due diligence processes, a system that would allow organizations to not have to repeat the sometimes quite rigorous and laborious due diligence processes that they tend to do when they get into an engagement with another partner, so they can cover their bases, and that would allow them to cut through some of the bureaucratic the red tape, let's say, and allow them to really focus their efforts elsewhere, and including on strengthening their security risk management systems, and to have scalable aid worker insurance solutions. That is another thing that is not talked about enough, but is really important. And that way, we're looking to find a way to convene those kind of brokers with those local actors to allow for more scalable, more locally tailored insurance solutions that ties to their needs and their specific risks. I'll stop there.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Dimitri. Just, Anthony, you said it's not necessarily only about financial resources, it's about basic principle of partnerships. When we speak of these principles, and you've mentioned some of them, what do we need to look at when partnership and security risk management? What is it, aside from the ones you've mentioned? What is it that we are speaking about? Christina, I know you had something to.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of things. So one is obviously that there are tools and standard practices and resources, and they're really quite important that they are shared. and made available to local partners because no one wants to reinvent the wheel. But at the same time, it is also a question of making sure that these practices and resources are properly adapted to the specific needs of the local partners. And I just want to share sort of two specific examples where I think there is a strong need to think of how this can be adapted. So evacuations, that's the sort of the last resort for INGOs and UN organizations when things get really difficult. But this is not necessarily a mechanism that local partners can use in the same kind of way, because they don't have any headquarters or countries of origin to be evacuated back to. And so at the worst case scenario, you would displace them towards another part of the country. So clearly evacuation is not something that should be the sort of the last thing in the toolkit for local partners. The same sort of goes for some standard practices around safe rooms, for example, because in these sort of high risk areas, they tend to be non-family duty stations. So clearly you can have some very sort of structured plans in terms of how you have safe rooms and how your staff might go in there. But sharing with local partners simply how many tins of food you need per staff member stacked in your safe room is not appropriate, because local partners obviously are part of the community. They are with their families, their communities, and so you need to develop the policies that define what is the responsibility of the local organization and their international partners in responding during a real crisis. So these are just two sort of examples of where there is a need to adapt what are typical practices. But I mean, that said, I think what everyone has already sort of pointed out in terms of the policies, the structures, the needs assessment for security, the thinking about the policies, there is a lot that can be shared and passed on. But the sort of the last point I would want to make is echoing of what everyone else has already said about the need for partnership. I think what is really essential is that the international actors and the local partners learn to understand the complementarity, their different roles within the security risk management. And there is one particular area that is very, very challenging. And this is something that I've heard several times from local partners who stayed in areas. And it is that they are extremely vulnerable, and they can easily feel abandoned and forgotten by their international partners when they evacuate and leave. And that, I think, is something where there are hard questions to be asked for the international partners in this partnership. What is their role and responsibility to support local actors in this extremely difficult situation when they couldn't have been evacuated?
Yeah, just bouncing on this, Christina, and speaking of partnerships, and from my previous experience, when we engage in partnerships, we look at it on a programmatic point of view. We look at it on the program, not necessarily the design, but what needs to be done. But I'm wondering, when organizations are looking at partnership, is security risk management, both the one from the partner as well as the collective approach to security risk management, is it discussed appropriately? Are people who are in charge of partnership the best place to ask these questions and understand the needs and be able to look at it holistically for partners? Anyone on this question?
Eric, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Stefan.
I think we are touching a very sensitive issue, and I would say it's not just semantic, but defining what partnership means and putting that means into the context where we are going to implement that partnership is extremely important. And I think it's a step that we have tried to make for many years, but it's not that simple. In the last WP annual partnership meeting with all of our partners, it was clear that one of the stabbing point is what is this partnership? Because at least in WP, it ranges for a sort of contract to implement a portion of a program, and that will be renewed every year or every 2 years. And it can range up to having global reach on specific thematic area with a particular partner. Now, if we want to try to implement or design a security risk management system that take into account that, then we have to do a really serious introspective review, and that's what WP has engaged for now, and understand exactly what we mean with that partnership, and we put into a context, because a frontline territory is not the same as implementing school feeding in a capital within the same country context. So I think the challenge is really to make some clarity on this partnership meaning, because attached to it, what Christina says is very important. You know, there's many responsibility that need to be taken into consideration, and for sure that counting the tin of food that you put in the safe room is not the solution for that.
But I was going back to what Anthony was saying at the beginning on the basic principles of partnership. When is this discussed? Is it ever discussed, or should it be discussed? And that's the important question. I think, without necessarily being too critical, but I do think that when partnerships are considered with local NGOs, and we know there are needs, but those needs are not necessarily discussed. Is there anybody who has best practices, or at least examples of how we could do this better? Yeah, Anthony. Sorry, Julia.
No, but if I may, we have found as a best practice about this to really try to integrate this at least in the design phase, so really have a kind of joint metrics that applies both to program and then security risk management. But so we join the two perspectives, and then trying, at least throughout the project to have kind of workshop. And again, you asked before, are partnership people the best place to discuss this? I would say no. I would say partnership people, they can create the good framework for this discussion, but then it's good to have this kind of peer-to-peer conversation and exchange, and really feed the implementation with this exchange.
Yeah. Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, I think just jumping off what Julia said, I think there's an important point here, which is you can't separate security risk management from program design, right? And I think that you need to have that integrated conversation. I think that needs to be best practice. And it's interesting, as Stefano was saying, that we need to define partnership. I think this kind of highlights a little bit in terms of how far we've moved from the principles of partnership. The principles of partnership define partnership, right? It gives equality, transparency, results-oriented approach, responsibility, complementarity. The fact that we're not doing that as part of our partnership approach, that our partnership people are not well placed to have that holistic conversation, just demonstrates how little we've integrated our pre-existing commitments into the sector. And this is why we end up having these discussions around, okay, are we doing risk sharing, when effectively they were supposed to be part of the core way in which we partnered from the start, right? And I think there are now new initiatives which I think can also help with this. So I worked when I was in Sudan with the emergency response rooms on risk sharing through the new IASC risk sharing guidelines. And one of the great things about that is it enables at the start that more holistic way of looking at risk, both because it looks at it broader than just security risk, but also financial risk, reputational risk, etc. But it also accepts that risk isn't just something that's on local partners. In our partnership with local NGOs, we're also absorbing some risk. Risk is, it's not shared necessarily, but it's spread across a delivery chain. And we also need to recognize that as we engage with local partners, as international organizations, we do absorb different risks and also have different capacities. And the risk sharing framework provides a really good framework for having that conversation, accepting, as Christina said, the complementarity of our approaches. What role do we as international actors play? What role do local actors play in this situation? And coming towards a mutual understanding of the risks that we all have, including the donors, and then creating a pathway to address those. And I think that's, something that can be operationalized now with the new IASC guidelines to then, start to, again, get better at this conversation, even if it feels like we're reinventing the wheel somewhat from the principles of partnership. Maybe a new guidelines, a new document, a new packaging for a new age helps us get better at this.
Okay. Anybody else on that subject? Before we were supposed, and El Mehdi was to join us to discuss this particular project, which tackles some of the points that we've just mentioned. But
yeah, I can add a little bit more
sorry,
on this
Kristen.
sort of discussion of how I think we need to think more of how the security risk managers and program delivery work hand in hand when we think about programs that are delivered through local partners. So one specific example from South Sudan at the moment. So there are possibilities. You can track the food from Port Sudan down to Darfur and potentially put the drivers at risk, put the warehouse managers at risk, put the people who distribute the food at risk, and communities who access the food. Or you can opt for cash distribution as a way of making it individually safer. So usually these decisions, do you bring direct food or do you do cash distributions, are done from a programmatic or other consideration. But I think what we very rarely see is that these sort of programmatic decisions are joined by security risk managers who then provide their perspective of what the relevant cost or risk is of delivering a program in this or that way, because of the consideration of the risk to both the local partners who do this work and the communities who access it. And I think that's the sort of element that we're quite often missing, because both the security risk managers often don't really think in a programmatic way, and I feel that's their programmatic colleagues' job. And I think in many cases, programs are delivered without having a security risk manager respond with a risk assessment for local partners and the communities accessing the particular aid.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, when we discuss risk transfer, there are two ways to understand risk transfer. It's one is security strategy in passing on a programmatic activity with a lower level of risk, but then I'm not totally sure that this is done always the right way when we look at it. And then it's also looking at the risk generated to a partner as this program comes with itself a perception and therefore a risk associated to it. And I think that those are two discussions that need to happen. So risk transfer as a strategy, but what does it mean for, is it really done the right way? But second, is it always looked at the impact this partnership would have on the local partner? So, Julia, I don't want to put you on the spot because El Mehdi was supposed to explain the project, but I'm just going to ask you to maybe start, and then we will see when El Mehdi join. We speak about adaptation. We speak about listening to the needs of local NGOs. And I'd like to turn to you and hopefully El Mehdi when he joins, as well as Dimitri, to go through the best practice that was implemented in the Sahel through the Partage project. So if you can just take us through the project and help us understand how this project with its different components actually helped the security risk management with local NGOs.
Yes, thanks a lot. It's a pleasure being here and having the opportunity to draw everyone's attention on this topic, and also the lesson learned that we have from this project that was funded by DG ECO and is currently implemented in Mali and Burkina Faso. We decided to design this project because we have seen that the targeting of aid workers was deeply concerning in the area. And it's important to stress that the local organizations seem particularly exposed. If we check the statistic, we see that the majority of fatalities for aid workers in the last years were for employees of national NGOs. In Mali in particular, the number of humanitarian accidents, especially in terms of kidnapping, are in the record of the most affected countries. And this despite the efforts from local authorities to make areas safe. We see that the number of security incidents in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali continue to escalate. And we also don't know the exact features because there is an underreporting, a chronic underreporting of attacks by the local actors. So we see that in particular in the Sahel, there is a really complex and deteriorating security landscape, given at the same time by escalating conflicts, the political instability, the climate change effect, and the socioeconomic vulnerability brought by that. And also, but Christina may explain this better than me, the hostile use of social media, meaning that they become a way for disinformation and really targeted assessment. So this exposed the local actors to direct violence like kidnappings, armed attacks, but also bureaucratic hurdles, intricate local power dynamics. So it's really a situation that is hard to navigate. And we also need to consider that there is a pressure for rapid humanitarian response that is understandable, but is often driven by international attention, internationally driven funding cycles, and this can transfer the risk to local actors because we are exposing them to some impossible choices between life-saving aid delivery, their financial sustainability, and their staff safety. So when designing the Partage program, I discussed with many local actors in the area, and I was really struck by their dedication and engagement about operating in this condition. At the same time, I was shocked by the extent to which their security management was almost fully in the hands of their international donors or partners, meaning that security budgets, but often also operational decisions, were externalized, weren't taken by these local actors. So they have a very limited control over it. We even conducted a baseline study in the Sahel, and we have seen 98% of the respondents were working in high-risk area. But of this huge number, just 9% said that they have a reliable risk management system. So really, this big evidence was given by a combination of factors. We can indeed mention funding and the unequal support given to local organizations compared to international actors. Also, the participant requested training, mentoring, and comprehensive coverage of security-related costs. But I think that also emerged clearly that this situation was the result of an internationally driven support. What I mean is that the local actors dispose sometimes of some limited security protocols and security system or risk analysis, but these systems were really dependent on the funders' project duration and the condition or SOPs of the international partner. So with this reflection together, and we understood that to achieve a sustainable empowerment and a true localization in risk management, we needed to recognize that there was a need of a locally driven strengthening process. So something based on peer-to-peer support, mentoring, flexible funding for the security system development that need to be tailored to local actor needs. So inside the Partage project, what we have done was, for example, to develop a capacity sharing model in which the concepts are explained by some local coaches. And the coaches are not Interso staff, they are not our staff, but they are directly identified and trained by Bioforce, that is our partner in this project, among the local NGOs that are present in high-risk areas of Mali, and that are partner of the Ponant, which is the local platform. So it was really great to see how this was participatory identification of the coaches, allow to have really an horizontal model, you know. And this model, so the presence of the coaches and the fact that they were there, they were pre-existing colleagues of all the target organization, allowed really to overcome some challenges, for example, the language. So we could really include in the targeted civil society organization some really local responders and their staff that so had the training material in local languages like Bambara, Peul, and Songhai, and were actively involved in the training. And also their constant presence in this area allowed the proximity, a follow-up, and so in this way, they could really support the civil society organization in the empowerment journey, but following their priority and their pace. I mean, also, Intersos and Depona now are launching dedicated microgrants opportunities. So it's some funding really to allow this smaller organization to receive some financial support to develop their security management systems. And this again is to allow them to be decision makers in their growing pathway, you know, and without depending on external dynamics. So I think this was feasible because, first of all, partnering with local coordination platform like Pona was essential to really develop this ownership, you know, and this sustainable impact, because everything was done together or by the platform. And as Elmedi will explain, this really make the impact a little bit broader in terms of targeting and also in terms of cascading effect. It was also important for Intersos to work at systemic level, meaning that we want to ensure that the available high technical standard support system were also available and tailored to the local needs. So that's why, for example, we collaborated with Security Insight on raising awareness about the risk of social media, disinformation, and the impact they may have on local access. Also, as part of the Partage program, GISF developed this French language on live resource with tools, policies, and materials that are based on the demands of local NGOs from the Sahel, as Dimitri will explain. But before leaving the word to Dimitri and Elmedi, just one conclusion. I wanted to bring the words that quite impressed me from one of the participants, local NGO involved in Partage. So she explained that at the beginning, she really thought that security risk management was something that for her was a third-party responsibility, you know, something used to delegate to someone external. But now she really understood that both the organization and the staff have mutual responsibility related to SRM and duty of care. And for this reason, she felt more confident in operating in high-risk environment. And this is the kind of ownership we were looking for. So now I'll hand the word to Dimitri, maybe, to say some word about the work they are doing on Partage.
Sure. Thank you, Julia. Just to pick up where you've left off, I just wanted to flag a couple of things that we have done from a research study. We did a needs assessment study across Burkina Faso, Mali, and we also engaged with some regional actors in the Senegal. The purpose of this was to kind of, as Julia stated, get a better sense of what are the particular needs, the locally and contextually relevant to those national and local actors, and see how we could, as Christina flagged, not try to, start from scratch, but basically find ways to adapt and tailor existing resources that are widely available, or that's a question mark, actually. Well, I'll get to it. But existing resources that are available to a lot of international actors and how they could be adapted and tailored to local actors. And so from this needs assessment study, we basically asked a lot of point-blank questions about some of the challenges that these local national actors face when it comes to setting up their own security risk management processes, their structures, and their strategies, or lack thereof at times, and just to understand what level of awareness they might already have of SRM resources that are out there, and what are the particular needs when it comes to practical, applicable, field-ready sort of tools that are useful for their context wherever they go in various regions in their countries. And so key things that came out of the sort of baseline needs assessment was that pretty much most, if not all, SRM resources that are out there, there's quite a wealth of materials, but a lot of them are not adapted to local contexts. They're sort of generalized resources, and for good reason to some extent. Obviously, you have different organizations operating at different sizes and scales, but they are primarily tailored to the sort of INGO actor who often sends staff or work through their country offices. And a lot of the resources that are there tend to be a bit long and bloated, often filled with technical terms, some jargon and so on, and they're not always applicable to the needs of local actors. Another problem is that a lot of the resources are available primarily in English. There's the language barrier that Julia brought up, and that's something that the Partage project seek to address. For the purposes of how we're hoping to adapt this in an online resource, we have primarily focused on French as it is the common tongue across those countries. But the intention, eventually, hopefully at some point, is to try to see how we can further adapt things to local languages. And then the reality is a lot of the resources that are out there are designed for large NGOs, ones that have significant both human and financial resources, both of which sometimes local or national orgs simply don't have. And accessibility was a problem. There's just awareness, discoverability, accessibility, these are all issues that had been flagged. So part of that response that we did was to try to disseminate a lot of the resources that are already out there that could be useful to local actors, make sometimes significant adaptations to those existing resources to meet certain needs, highlighting particular risks and challenges that they face. For instance, one key risk that was flagged time and time again was the high risk of abduction and kidnapping in those particular contexts, as well as dealing with improvised explosive devices and increasingly drones and other things like that. So we've been adapting, if not creating, resources from scratch to respond to those based on the needs that they flagged, as well as for more effective budgeting, how to start with creating a budget for security risk management, which some of the organizations flagged they had challenges doing. And how to address the growing threat of the digital threats, misinformation, disinformation. That's where Insecurity Insights work comes to support this. So in response to all this, we basically developed, as Julia mentioned, a local NGO security toolbox that's online. The vast majority of those resources, it's over 100 or so at this stage, and it's iterative. So we're building it as we go. And a lot of those are downloadable, accessible offline. And that's important because it's, especially in some more remote regions, it's quite difficult to try to access them online. And they cover major themes that are cross-cutting and provide a sort of through line across all aspects that are important for security risk management. So there is an element around the sort of fundamental aspects of it, the basics of SRM, understanding the different concepts, the terminology, the theory bit behind it, and some of the fundamental structures that are required. And how to strategize for security risk management, not just do it in a reactive manner, but also looking at how to, basically action out contextual analyses that a lot of local actors are well versed in doing in the first place, and how to basically apply that into their own security risk management processes and doing effective risk evaluation, security planning and incident response. A lot of protocols and existing rules are there, whether it's sort of movements on the road or how to deal with kidnapping situations and so on. Also information management. And then there's a whole dedicated area around partnerships, both engaging in collaboration amongst local and national organizations, but as well as with INGOs, and of course the sort of deconfliction lens that's required when it comes to engaging with state and military actors around NGO coordination. And then lastly, there's resources we've laid out to have access to free to register and free to use training courses from lots of peers in this space that go from personal safety and security, but also to various things that are in some cases tailored to the particular needs of local actors, and then room for professional development, which is also an area of concern. So I just try to give a broad-based overview of what this toolbox is like. As I said, it's a living document, and we're trying to build upon it as we go along further in the project, and future lessons come in, and lessons learned from our continuous accompaniment and engagement with local actors. And so that is a way that we're tangibly trying to address some of the challenges that have been flagged to begin with. But yeah, I can pass it back to Julia if Elmedi hasn't joined us, in case she wishes to comment on any of the points that Pona, our local consortia partner, wanted to flag in this call.
Actually, Elmedi is connected, but he cannot activate his mic. So I don't know if Liwei can try to solve this issue.
I think he may not be connected on
Sure,
the
I'm on it.
panelist
Yeah.
on the panelist group. So I don't know. I will wait to see if my colleague can work wonders and try to bring him on board on the panel. But I just wanted to react on this before we go to maybe Elmedi's view on the project and the benefits of it. Is what strikes me, and it goes back again. And I think that's, I don't want to necessarily come already to the conclusion of this panel, but we spoke about partnerships, and one of the things that both Julia and Dimitri highlighted is putting at the disposal of local NGOs a certain number of resources. I'm not speaking about financial, I'm speaking about packages. And it strikes me a little that this is one of the main issue that we are facing, particularly when we're engaging in partnerships, is I have your discussion and what you presented highlights the fact that international NGOs or UN agencies may not be very keen to engage with local partners in these resources. Some training may be happening, but in the particularly in the Sahel, I mean, the Partage project is an example of a potential gap that needs to be filled. And I think as we're discussing basic principles of partnership, I think that is an important part of making sure that discussions are taking place, both from the inception of the program as well as the partnership and how it's going to be looked at and what is the capacity of the national or the local partner to implement, but also manage the security risk management. So we will wait if Elmedi can join us on the panel
Sure.
group. But I just wanted to maybe offer the floor to Christina, because you mentioned, Julia, you mentioned Christina and the part that Christina played, or Insecurity Insight played in the project in raising the disinformation or misinformation aspect.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, as everyone said, that's a sort of component of this project to understand how the digital space is affecting the overall security risk. And this issue is really very sort of complex and nuanced, but in broad terms, what we've sort of discovered through this project is that the digital space in the Sahel is used to question the value of aid and the presence of any foreign support for activities, be it healthcare, education, community development. So the whole concept of aid is being questioned on social media repeatedly. And then we've also seen a few cases where they are very real security risks to individuals, and that usually comes from a narrative that paints the activities of international NGOs as being in support of what is locally labeled as terrorists. And that then leads online to a narrative of justification to attack those who've come to support the terrorists, who therefore undermine the states of the Sahel. And that narrative is really regularly coming through. And there have also been one incident where one driver was actually shot, and there were later sort of tweets going around saying, well, what do you expect? He was there to support terrorists. So there are real security risks coming from the online space, in addition to undermining aid as a concept. But since we're discussing the aspect of local partners here, what is striking is that this digital space essentially attacks foreign aid. We don't really find the same kind of narrative being applied to local partners. In fact, it is the local partners who tend to get quite positive responses to what they're posting. So I think that's actually an area where the international sector can also learn something from the local organizations in terms of how they manage to present their activities on a digital space. But at the same time, I think we also need to be aware that the humanitarian space is continuously shrinking. And in Niger in particular, we've seen some influencers who on social media defended the concept of aid actually being imprisoned. So there may also be reasons that there are particular risk to local partners in engaging around these subjects overall on the sort of digital space. So it complicates things in today's world in really worrying, but also very complex matters that differ from one country to the next and are not very easy to address with the existing sort of protocols we have.
Yeah, Christina, while you're on the subject, and the Partage project is about a particular geographic area, but you mentioned the particular mention of aid and the criticism and then the threats that are passed. But I was wondering, geographical areas, all of the activities, but are there particular programmatic activities that we also need to be looking at carefully when it comes to partnerships, local NGOs implementing it? Is there a particular risk for programmatic areas?
In my view, yes. I think in a way, we need to think about how programs are implemented and what this means for the security risk for sort of local partners, as I mentioned, with, for example, food distributions. But I think we also need to be very aware that different programs, by their very nature, expose local partners to very different risks. And we've worked particularly on the health sector, and that on its own is a programmatic area that is at an extreme risk for the very reason that you can't deliver healthcare remotely. You always need to have the contact between the patient and the healthcare provider. You need to have hospitals that are clearly visible, that are identifiable places. And also healthcare needs to be there where the conflict injured are. So, healthcare is at a huge risk. But that also means that we need to think of very specific security risk management practices that are adapted to particular programs, because some programs can do certain things remotely to improve safety and security, others can't. And so that's also why we put out, also as part of this Partage project in French, a sort of a guide on how to think about security risk management for the health sector, focusing on the one hand on acceptance by focusing on awareness raising, but also recognizing the very important aspect that all measures need to keep the focus of the activity in mind. So you can't just do security risk management to protect a staff member. You need to think about delivering healthcare. And that leads to really complicated choices and complex decisions in terms of what you can and should not do. And then we have this issue that healthcare sometimes is specifically targeted, and then that would require having very specific security risk management structures in place that fundamentally alter the way programs are delivered. So for healthcare, for example, you can take the whole process of healthcare apart with having post-ops in different places to where people are waiting to have a consultation just to reduce the risk for individual patients because you don't have such big groups of people in one place. And that also makes it easier for staff. But the costs of implementing such security risk measures through a health system are phenomenal and very difficult to sort of implement. But I would take it back to the sort of the overall thing we're discussing here is what can be the support that the international organizations need to give to their local partners to ensure that they can do all of these things. So I think we really need to rethink all of this security risk management support to local partners from multiple perspectives. And as you say, it's very context specific, because in some places there are huge health systems that are bombed. In other places there is very little healthcare there, and it's and that all requires very different approaches. So cookie cutter is not what helps us here. So that's why the sort of conversation with the local partners and understanding both their delivery objectives and their day-to-day risks are just so important.
Yeah, I think one of the takeaway that I have so far is that cookie cutter, as you said, doesn't work, and adapting the tools to the audience in a sense, or to the partners is key. So I'm sorry, because it seems that we have an issue bringing El-Mehdi in. We don't seem to be able to get him, and it's really sad, because that was a very local perspective on the project. I thank Julia and Dimitri for being able to have explained what the project was, but I think it would have been much easier, even though a little bit more complicated for me, because I would have had to do translation. But it would have been really helpful to have El-Mehdi's point. So to the audience, I will make sure that we have the written part of El-Mehdi's intervention, at least with the points he wanted to make, or he had shared in previous sessions, so that you can also hear from not only a local NGO, but also a platform on the project. So we'll post this if El-Mehdi is unable to join. I think we've answered the question already in a lot of cases, but in security risk management, there's always been, or at least it's the strategy, is that if we are to do a transfer of an activity to a partner, it is a strategy to lower the risk. So we need to identify a partner that can deliver. But is that always true, or is that actually the reality on the field? Does this work as a security strategy? Over to any one of you. Yeah, Anthony.
So as I think is clear, it's more complex than that, right? So from the data that we have as INSO, it's quite clear that national NGOs report a higher rate of serious incidents than any other actor. It's about 35% of the incidents that we have for national NGOs are serious, so killing, abduction, injury of staff. For the UN and INGOs, it's around 20%, right? So it's a big difference in terms of just the rate of serious incidents that national NGOs globally are exposed to. But as Christina outlines, in some places and exposed to some types of risks, national NGOs may be less at risk than international actors. And similarly, different international actors and different national actors will have different risks, right? So there's essentially a profile that you have as an individual, as an organization, that exposes you to a specific type of risk. And again, I think what we're all saying a little bit is the basis of risk sharing is having a meaningful and transparent conversation around those profile orientated risks, whether that's internally around the staff or between organizations, and then putting in place appropriate mechanisms, whether that's appropriate financial resources, appropriate tools and kind of guidance, appropriate insurance mechanisms, appropriate information sharing protocols, whatever that is, to be able to manage that risk. I think one of the other points of this is around, kind of as maybe was clear in my answer, was, that also applies to in many cases, our national staff. We make a lot of the same risk transfer decision, not just to local partners, but also to our national staff. And at least in INSO's database, national staff working for INGOs contribute to the majority of incidents that we have in our database, right? So in terms of risk exposure, we still see a lot of risk transference even within our own organizations. I think this comes back to maybe a final point is, when we're looking at the role of international organizations and what this means in terms of partnership, I think we also shouldn't take this as as an excuse to become less proximate as international actors with communities that we serve. We still have a role to play in accompanying our national staff and our national partners in the delivery of those services. And I actually think that that's where maybe we've taken a step back in seeing localization and partnership as a way in which we remove ourselves from frontline activities, or as international actors, we remove ourselves from frontline activities. And we've not necessarily adopted the accompaniment model, which is actually piloted and implemented by the majority of NGOs who specialize in partnership, will have some type of accompaniment model where they work alongside their local partners to deliver that. And I think basically from not knowing much about the Partage project, but essentially that seems to be also the modality of the Partage project as well, which I think has contributed to that success. So I think it's around walking in step with our national and local partners, as opposed to, using this as a way in which we become less proximate with communities.
All right.
Eric?
Yeah, Stefano.
I would like to add a few points on what Christina and you and Anthony have said. And in particular on the subject of what to transfer or what to adapt to our security risk management systems that we have at the UN level and some of the bigger international NGOs. And if you carefully read that, and it's one of the things that I have in my mind since some time now, we reduce ourselves looking at risk and managing, reducing, transferring those risks. And we have accepted that the threat is equal to every actors in the humanitarian space, which is not actually the case. All the discussion about the community engagement, the proper communication through the virtual space, because you are closer to the heart of the people, are clearly indication that maybe we should broaden our view and not look just at the security risk management as we intended it today, but in the past, I'm talking about, about 20 years ago, there was more attention in looking at the threat environment and trying to preempt as much as possible. Now that we have what we didn't have at that time, which is this huge advantage of having local organizations, civil society that can contribute to easier or lower that threat. I think that's where the real partnership could be. So I think we should look at both sides, what we can contribute, but how we can really partner with our local partner to reduce the threat environment, which we haven't really talked too much about it.
But I think one of the point that was made, and at least that's how I understand it, it's true that we've been discussing a lot about understanding the needs, understanding what is being done and what the security risk management or lack thereof is with local partners. But I also hear it in a way, in having this discussion also allows us to get information, and it is a two-way street. It is an effort. I would say a lot of the international actors, when looking at a particular situation, is exactly what you've said. We tend to have maybe one security risk management process and outcome that we then assume fit to all. And we don't have necessarily that discussion. It goes back to the point that Anthony raised. It's about having this granular assessment that applies to international, national, local actors, even within an organization, having more of a person-centered approach with making sure we look at the vulnerabilities and the potential advantages or strategies that organizations have, so that we can learn from each other. And I think when we're discussing partnerships, that is the important part of the partnership, is having this discussion that goes beyond just imposing on the next actor over something that has been developed and lacks either an understanding or a granularity that is very, very important, be it on programs, locations, type of actors. And I think this is at least what I'm taking from it. But Stefano, since you are a partnership officer with WFP, I was wondering, and maybe that's the way to stop before we can open for Q&A, if if partnerships or the localization, the way it's done today, is not taking all of the lessons that were shared, I hope for the last hour, what are the risks aside maybe from security? Are there additional risks that we need to consider? I think it's a pretty obvious answer, but the discussion today is about security risk management, and therefore the end result and the negative one that we've seen in 2024 is that if we don't achieve to do effective security risk management collectively, then we have an increase of incidents, but there's more to it than just the increase of incidents.
Yeah, I think it's important to again connect properly what we are trying to achieve with risk management and the reality on the ground. I think we've been quite reactive so far, and the reaction has not been taken then later as a lesson learned and put into a framework that we can use to really build a system that can serve the localization process. We've been not good at all. And it's a complex, not that we haven't been willing, it's really a complex issue to deal with. And that goes for all the risk we have been hearing before, fiduciary risk, financial risk, reputational risk. And all of those contribute to the resilience of our humanitarian space, which is definitely under a tremendous stress. The number of incidents is a good indication, but I would say even a bigger indicator is how less we can deliver compared to 5 years ago. So the shrinking is not just because of the number of security incidents that we encounter, but is the effectiveness and the capacity that we have in delivering those programs. So to preserve that space and to try to get it bigger again, I think a huge effort, and that has to start. And I put my hand up as one of the potential organizations that haven't really channeled enough energy in understanding better those dynamics and what we can do to preserve that space. Sometimes having local partner could be an enabler to get that humanitarian space bigger and stronger. In other places, the localization process might actually be at the end a negative influence to that space. So all of this need to be talked better, and definitely there is a need for the donor community to be involved as well, because they are a big driver of decision. We have used this term before when we go to the local organization, but definitely a big drivers are our donors. They are asking us to do more for localization, and I think it's our duty and responsibility also to have this fair and granular discussion with our local partner and bring those issues back to the donors and say, this is the effort that is required if we want to do it, and bring up options that we haven't really yet started. In WP, as I said before, we have started an introspective exercise, trying to understand better integration of security, risk management, program and supply chain to see how do we pack this risk approach in our field level agreement. There's a document which will be the strategy for resilience of our local partner that is on the making. But we are also aware that we cannot do it alone. So we have started a forum with our biggest international NGO partner to understand what we can do collectively to make those tools available to the local, what kind of training, what type of risk management best practices. But I think we are still far from that. And the collection of the view of the local partner is very important. I think for us, going back to the food delivery, Christina, the challenge is through, unfortunately, people tend to eat more than once per day, possibly, and therefore the supply chain need to be there. Sometimes we call partnership also things that should be treated as commercial contract for other purposes rather than partnership. Because as I said at the beginning, the semantic is important. And the plethora and the portfolio of different local actors that are available in the different countries where we operate does not allow to have one or two solutions that fit every possible context. So more scrutiny is needed. Those partnership discussions are very solid and will bear fruit very quickly if that partnership is a solid long-time partnership. For a 6 months full delivery or a year wash delivery, it's very difficult to implement anything that we are discussing today. So that's my view at the moment.
All right, thank you, Stefano. I am going to say we should now open for question and answer, but I am really happy to see El Mehdi with us. El Mehdi, bonjour.
Bonjour, ça n'a pas été facile, j'étais obligé de changer d'ordinateur en fin de compte. Donc,
Oui.
j'ai pu maintenant vous rejoindre. Merci.
Alors, merci de votre présence. To the audience, let me introduce El Mehdi Aguakina, who is the director of, and I would have to go back, local NGO in Mali, and also the president of the platform that Julia was mentioning in part of the Partage project. El Mehdi, je vais juste dire, on a quelques minutes. Julia et Dimitri ont expliqué le projet Partage. Je voulais juste, de votre côté, est-ce que vous pourriez me donner les points importants du bénéfice de ce projet et de ce que ça a pu amener aux partenaires? So my question to El Mehdi is to summarize the important points about the project, which Julia and Dimitri have presented earlier, and also the takeaways from the project from a local perspective. El Mehdi, à vous.
Merci vraiment pour cette opportunité, malgré les aléas de la technologie. Je ne vais pas répéter Julia et Dimitri. Donc, comme élément important pour nous par rapport tiré de ces projets, c'est vraiment l'approche participative et inclusive du projet. Donc, ce n'est pas un projet qui est venu comme ça, un prêt-à-porter, mais c'est vraiment un projet dont la mise en œuvre a été faite de façon participative. Ça, c'est le premier élément.
Alors, El Mehdi, je vous interromps, je vais juste essayer de traduire phrase par phrase. So the main point, at least from El Mehdi's point of view on the project and on the efforts that have been done, is to ensure this participatory and inclusive approach, both in the project, but in the way we're looking at security risk management. El Mehdi?
Parce que vous savez, les ONG nationales sont elles qui sont sur la première ligne de front. Donc, lorsque il y a assez de risques de sécurité, il est important qu'elles soient outillées.
So the national NGOs are at the front line. They are the ones responding to the crisis, and it is critical that when the risk is high, they are equipped and resourced to face the risk.
Donc, le projet, c'est vraiment, comment on appelle, c'est vraiment une action collective entre plusieurs organisations de la société civile. Il y a des ONG locales et même des associations au niveau communautaire qui se donnent la main pour travailler sur les questions de sécurité.
And so this project was able to get together national NGOs as well as civil society organizations in order to look at security collectively, thanks to the efforts done by Intrasource and GISF with the resources. El Mehdi?
De la même façon que la situation sécuritaire est volatile, il est important aussi de mettre en place des mécanismes de sécurité flexibles.
And so as the situation is volatile in Mali, it is critical that this project allowed or that the organizations put in place a security risk management system that is flexible to adapt to the needs as the situation evolves.
Et là, ces stratégies sont des stratégies qui sont mises en place par les ONG nationales pour les ONG nationales.
And that it is a project that is put in place by national NGOs for national NGOs, which speaks again to understanding the needs, and who better can understand the needs than local organizations.
Donc, la co-construction d'intervention adaptée est un élément extrêmement important de ce projet.
And one critical part of the project is the joint design, or the co-design, if you want to use this word, or co-construction, as Elmedi said in French, of the various interventions throughout the life cycle, in a sense, of a project.
Parce que les gens pensent que des fois la localisation c'est un transfert de risques pour les ONG nationales. Donc il faut, et ce projet met en fait le fait qu'il ne s'agit pas seulement de renforcer les acteurs internationaux, mais plutôt aller à la base même, et cette base-là, c'est les ONG locales. Donc, il faut vraiment travailler à cette base-là pour avoir des actions plus durables.
And that the project help ensuring that the local actors were, in a sense, the recipient of the tools or the resources to make sure that it would be a more durable action, or more durable activities in the field, thanks to the project, rather than just the international NGOs establishing the partnerships.
Donc, vraiment, ce travail qui est fait sur le terrain, c'est un travail qui va assurer aussi bien la durabilité des interventions, mais aussi pour améliorer la façon d'intervenir sur le terrain.
And so the aim of the project, and at least potentially the first lessons or the first goals obtained in the project, is to ensure durability. And sorry, vous m'avez dit la durabilité, elle m'a dit, et
l'efficacité des actions.
And the efficiency or the various actions by the local NGOs. Elle m'a dit peut-être un dernier point.
Un dernier mot. Le projet Partage, c'est vraiment un projet qui place les acteurs locaux au centre de l'action humanitaire.
And so the project was succeeded in putting the local NGOs at the center of the humanitarian assistance, and in a sense I would expand and say, and security risk management as well.
Voilà ce que je peux ajouter, comme je n'ai pas beaucoup de temps, sinon on peut continuer toujours, mais on n'a pas beaucoup de temps. Merci.
Merci Elmedi. Thank you Elmedi. We now have about 13 minutes for Q&A, and that will be a little bit shorter than that, because I'll leave the floor for the panelists to summarize the panels and the key takeaways. What I do see here is a question, and maybe Anthony, you spoke of risk. You used the word risk appetite, but the question this time from one of the participants, or one of the member of the audience, is what is an acceptable risk to be transferred to a local partner?
So this is a very difficult question, because I think, again, it comes down to the conversation that you have, right? And firstly, I think primarily we need to move towards a risk sharing. Now, risk sharing doesn't necessarily mean that there's an equitable sharing of that risk, right? It's just an understanding around what are the different types of risk that the different actors in the delivery chain are exposed to, an acceptance of those risks, and an attempt to see, okay, firstly, are the measures taken by those individual organizations sufficient to try and treat that risk? Secondly, are the measures taken by different organizations making it more risky for somebody else down the line? So again, this comes back to like Christina's example of a decision taken in Port Sudan that, or to be honest, sometimes in Rome, that food needs to be delivered in this way, and the reality on the ground and the risks of that transfers onto local organizations. So does the risk that we're taking make it more risky for others? And then what measures can be put in place collectively to try and better mitigate or better treat some of those risks? I think, again, it's a collective decision. At the heart of all of this, it's what level of risk are we collectively able to tolerate within a specific delivery chain is a decision that can only be taken with all of those actors involved. And I think that that's the key point, is that actually too often they're taken by somebody further up the delivery chain, by a donor or an intermediary donor, and we never really have the conversation on what is the risk faced by the local partner, and therefore we actually don't know about what the risk transfer is. We haven't fully understood, and we're not aware of the power dynamics in the system, or we ignore the power dynamics in the system that maybe prevent local actors from articulating those risks during a contractual negotiation. Right, and so we need to create those spaces to have that conversation in a way that is holistic and applies to the principles of partnership. So yeah, that's just a way of me not answering effectively the direct question, in terms of, I don't think that there is a one size fits all, this is an acceptable risk to transfer to local implementing partners. To be honest, I kind of feel that the way in which the question is framed is almost the wrong way of dealing with that, because it's the focus on implementing partners, on a due diligence approach to risk management, which effectively is everything I think that's wrong with the way in which we're currently doing it. And there's a need to move to a more holistic way in terms of risk sharing and conversations and mutually acceptable risk.
Then, thank you. Anybody else on this one? Or I'm going to say I can ask the three other questions that are there in a sense all together. And I hope that we have, through this panel, try to address those. What happens to a local implementing partner who appears to be, and I assume this is the question, who appears to be lacking effective security risk management? What lessons do donors or international NGOs learn from these implementing partners, and what best can be done? So I will start by answering by saying, okay, if an implementing partner appears to have issues with security risk management, I mean, this is part of the discussion that needs to take place at the very beginning. It's understanding. I mean, I would expect an implementing partner raising the issues of facing difficulties or having particular needs. And I think as part of this discussion and as part of the project that was presented, it is a discussion that needs to happen. And therefore, what best can be done is to be able to resource the organization. And again, I don't want to say resource with necessarily the finance part, but ensuring that as we are entering a partnership, the discussion takes place exactly like Anthony said. You know, what is the acceptable risk for the partner, and then that we discuss with the partner on the needs and on what we can do to assist. And I think that's about one of the lessons from this panel is to have this conversation as we go through partnerships with national and local NGOs. Anybody else on the questions? Nope. Have I answered it, or the fact that I'm the moderator still allows you to contradict what I say if need be?
No, but I think you quite covered, because when you asked the question, my immediate thought was, I mean, is any risk for which we ensure together that they have the resource and the means to manage it? So that's all there.
And I would say I wouldn't necessarily call an NGO that's facing difficulty with security risk management defaulting on security risk management. I think it's important to not necessarily, it's just a semantic, it's just a term, but they're not necessarily, or maybe it is the case, but I need more clarification than, you're not defaulting on security risk management. You may need assistance. And I think as part of this discussion, as part of this panel, if there is one thing that I hope we're going to pass as a message, is that we need to engage in a much more holistic manner on entering into a partnership and being able, or as the aid becomes more and more local, that we do understand that there is a need and that we need to address this, both as a partner organization, as an organization on the side. I mean, you don't necessarily have to enter into a partnership to engage with other actors on how to do things in a certain manner, or to explain to them best practices. So now I'm just going to say we don't have any more questions, which is surprising. In a sense, I could take it as a glass half full and say we've answered most of the questions already. But I'm just going to turn to the panelists and say about 6 of us or 7 of us. So if we go through one big takeaway from this panel that people can walk out at 5 o'clock Geneva time and go back to their organization, or just think about it, what is the main takeaway of this panel? In no particular order, whoever wants first.
Sure, I can just jump in. I think I want to echo some things that Anthony was saying about creating spaces for those kind of open conversations. A lot of it is, there's an undertone of power dynamics at play, or sometimes just a difficulty articulating certain needs and not having the space to articulate those needs. So having those, like trying to create those spaces in partnership are extremely important from the outset. And that way it allows for everyone to sort of air out certain challenges they may face or certain needs that they have. It avoids this kind of dynamic of, if I'm to use the term used that it has a negative connotation, the defaulter thing. If they don't have, then that means they're lacking. Or they're not upholding their end of the bargain type of thing. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that, and so having those spaces is absolutely crucial. So that's something that I just want to flag.
Yeah, I would perhaps add to that as my big takeaway is that, in particular, triggered by this question, I think we really need a cultural change in the sense that it becomes normal to talk about these security challenges. And this question also sort of reminds me a little bit of the situation the NGO sector was like in maybe even 20 years ago, which says something how old I am. But at that point, it was NGOs would not want to tell their donor when they had a security incident because they felt they would not be funded if they admitted to what had happened to them. And that took a long cultural shift to say it is not the victim's fault if you're attacked. It's a question of getting the right support to put the right things in place and do the best you can. And I think it is that sort of cultural shift we need to have as part of this risk transfer, to open, as Dimitri says, the space for local partners to feel comfortable to talk about their needs. And certainly it should not be a blame game, because that's I think that's what we learned from the aid agencies. It's about being open about it and asking for help rather than thinking about the faults within individuals.
So if I may continue, I think what I would like to stress more, I mean, we are all here to talk about how to mitigate risk transfer, how to empower local actors. And I think it's really important that we all direct our collective and our individual efforts to support the local response, but according to their agenda, their needs. Really, we need to do step by step, but on their pathway. Local actor needs to remain the architect, the decision maker of this, because it's only through a really locally led process that we can foster that ownership and sense of responsibility over the risk management process that can bring us to a sustainable impact. So I think that if we can really, really support local actors to manage their own security, we are so building a more resilient humanitarian response system.
Anthony, Stefano?
Go ahead, Stefano.
No, I wanted to refer to probably the bigger takeaway I will have today, what Dimitri said when he was talking about whatever you call it, Dimitri, the vetting passport or
due diligence passport.
The due diligence passport, which is not one-way thing. It could be a two-way thing. So when you identify the context where you want to operate, you agree with the donors and the big UN or whatever you call it, the secondary donor, on what are the minimum standard you are expecting. Like I give you an example. For me, it was really shocking to find out that we were partnering with a local NGO in Ukraine. I was the head of supply chain, and we got incident and there was not even an insurance for the car, leave aside the passenger of the car when they were delivering close to the front line. So they're not a defaulter in the SRM, but it's clear that we haven't talked about it, we haven't discussed it, we haven't set aside the resources, we haven't told them, and maybe the passport comes in there when you have, third-party organization that comes and say, donors community, local NGO, let's brainstorm a bit and get the minimum standards, and then you can get your passport based on those minimum standards. And then when you have that in your hands, there's no problem in having a serious budget line in your field level agreement, service level agreement, whatever every organization has, that say, oh, the security cost for that has to be this minimum percentage of the value of the project, or the metric ton distributed, or the number of beneficiary. Because at one point we will have to be concrete, right? So we need to come up with something that makes sense from a risk management perspective and make sure that we advocate to have that budget to implement it. And I think that passport, due diligence passport, is really something that we could really start to think about it.
Anthony?
Yeah, so firstly, I think just to re-emphasize what Christina said, I can't sum it up better in terms of the need for a change of culture, in terms of how we address this issue. And I think that needs to be the starting point for this conversation. Not to contradict myself, but I also think that we need to just emphasize that we don't need to reinvent the wheel in terms of policy and process, right? We have policies in place that will help us get here. We have the principles of partnership, they've been there for a long time. We just need to implement them. We now have a risk-sharing framework that the IASC has approved, that people have invested in developing, that's being piloted in lots of countries, and provides a clear framework for how we enable those safe spaces to happen and have a more holistic and meaningful way of partnering and ensuring risk sharing across the delivery chain. I think we need to also make sure that we don't, to be honest, and this is maybe not to contradict Stefano, but we don't take and further solidify these due diligence approaches to how we do risk management. Right? And I know this is not necessarily what the due diligence passport is, but I think that we need to make sure that we are context specific, and it's really around creation of space and an avoidance of standard processes in terms of, we can just assign this much money to security risk management in all of our partnership agreements is not going to enable us to do better risk sharing. Right? Better risk sharing comes back to principles of partnership and transparency and engagement in program design. And we need to have that cultural shift, as Christina says, that says we can have a safe space where we can talk about incidents that we're having, we can address them in a meaningful and equitable way. And this is not around, okay, this much money or this due diligence process, it's really around that conversation. So again, I think this would come up by other people that have said it better, but those are my key takeaways.
Okay. Elmedi, juste une chose que vous voudriez passer à l'audience, un point important sur comment est-ce qu'on renforce la sécurité quand on parle de localisation ou de partenariat avec des ONG, le point important que vous voudriez mentionner.
Le point important que nous devons toujours quand même rapporter, c'est qu'il est primordial que dans le cadre d'une approche de localisation bien réfléchie, tout doit se faire en parfaite symbiose avec les bénéficiaires qui sont soit les ONG nationales, les ONG locales ou les communautés. Donc, toujours une approche de bas en haut et non une approche de haut en bas. Voilà ce que je vais ajouter. Merci.
Merci, Elmedi. All right, so just for you to keep all this in mind as we're coming to the end of this panel, I've heard important words. Not that I expected those words coming out of this panel, but I've heard cultural change, which I think you may hear in other sessions as well. But cultural change, creating space, making sure that it is a bottom-up approach, as Elmedi just mentioned, making sure that we in those spaces, and thanks to a cultural change, we take the views of the local partners as part of localization. As a local process first, Julia, a local process with an international hand to help in the process, shared responsibility, and then, as Anthony said, implement existing resource which is already there to help in this topic. I would like to thank the panelists. It was a pleasure to have you today. And sorry again, pardon El-Mehdi pour les problèmes techniques. But j'étais vraiment content que vous puissiez vous joindre à nous. Thank you to the audience, and have a good week of HNPW. And I will maybe see you sometimes during the 2 weeks. Thank you very much, and have a good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Merci.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Merci. Dimitri, Julia, au revoir.
Merci El-Mehdi.